This conference this afternoon will be delivered by Alan Chong. Alan Chong is director of the Asian Civilization Museum and the Peranakan Museum, dedicated to exploring the historical connections among Asian cultures and between Asia and the world. He is also a member of the Singapore National Heritage Board. The Asian Civilization Museum has just opened the first phase of these new galleries, and it will unveil further space in the course of 2016. Before coming to the Asian Civilization Museum, Alan Chong was curator of the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum in Boston. His area of research are in a cross-cultural art, his area of research are in a cross-cultural art, artistic patronage, and the history of collecting. Alan Chong holds Bachelor of Art from Yale University and got its PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Please a very warm welcome to Mr. Alan Chong.
Thank you very much. I should say welcome to Singapore. I understand many of you are recent arrivals. I hope you have a good time here. Can you all hear me? Is this clear enough? Yes. Great. The theme of your series of lectures and sessions is Life is Work and Work to Live. And I actually didn't know that until a few minutes ago. So all I can say is that I'm a museum professional. I've worked in museums for a very long time. And we often struggle with the role of what a museum is. Is it part of society? Is it a tourist attraction? Is it a cultural enhancement? Is it an extra thing in society as opposed to an essential aspect of the social fabric? And this is particularly the case in Singapore, where literally for a long time, culture and the museum world were seen as extras. We're not essential to economic development. We're not seen as part of the big financial drive that was going to develop the new economies of Southeast Asia and of Singapore. And it's only with the enlightened approach of a few cabinet ministers who actually came from the military, but saw that culture could play a very important role in enhancing society, not only in developing a sense of nation building, of patriotism, but also of, spurring creativity in society as a whole. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting dynamics that Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries are going through at the moment, is this nature of creativity. What does art tell us about how we approach government, innovation, science, but also business? One could also argue that museums are, of course, now big businesses. The great museums of the US and of Europe make a lot of money overseas, have become huge institutions, not only drivers of economic tourism, but also drivers of the economy generally. So this is part of the problem we've been facing. What are museums? Are we cultural? Are we artistic? Are we businesses? Are we meant to make money? Do we help the politicians reinforce the sense of nation building? In fact, this will be the main topic of my presentation a little bit later. I just want to emphasize this in particular, that all museums, in fact, are political institutions. We all need to play a role in society as a whole. I'm focusing on the Asian Civilizations Museum. This is an artistic rendering. It's in the colonial hub of Singapore. It's right on the Singapore River, as you can see in this rendering. It, in fact, was built on this location as a colonial administration building. This is where the governor sat, where the customs house sat, where the head of police and the treasury was all located. The building began in the 1860s, and it's only in 2000 that the building became a museum. But the location is very important because it sits on Singapore's port. And if you've got some time, you should go and visit it. It's across from the Fullerton Hotel. It's a colonial as well as a contemporary experience, so it's a lot of fun. The museum dates to the 1860s, but its beginnings were rather weak. There were a few things that were collected in Malaysia and Indonesia that were given to the museum, and it slowly and rather randomly built up over the next century. And it's only until 1992 that the museum was actually split into major institutions, and a lot of money were given to the museums to build them up. And so there was a museum devoted to history, another museum devoted to modern art, basically Singaporean artists that were created in the 20th century, and finally to a museum of heritage cultures. And that's what this museum is. It is meant to reflect the immigrant cultures of Singaporeans. And this was Chinese, Indian, and Southeast Asia. Now you'll notice instantly that there's something missing from this group of people, and that is the colonial Europeans were completely left out of this narrative. And this is something that happened in a lot of nations, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, that the role of Europe in Asia was written out, except in the most negative way, as an antagonist, as a colonial force, as an imperialist power, as a bringer of war. This is the case, for example, in the Vietnamese National Museum in Hanoi. And this is, of course, very problematic because Europeans have been in Asia since the 15th century. And this intermingling, what I call the multiple identities, is something that we face a lot in trying to resolve. So, some key questions about identity that we've tried to face at the Asian Civilizations Museum. What is identity? Is it nation? Is it ethnic group? Is it religion? Is it language? Is it a combination of all these things? Unlike many nation states, Singapore cannot claim a majority culture in any of these areas, even though it's majority Chinese ethnicity. The heritage languages of the Chinese immigrants were very different. The languages that they speak now on a day-to-day basis are different. And increasingly, their religion is different. The rise of Christianity, the maintenance of traditional Chinese religions, and the growth of new forms of Buddhism means that there is no majority of any particular aspect of this in Singapore. It's different, for example, from China or Japan or even Malaysia. Actually, it's very similar in Malaysia when you think about it. And rightly, the Singapore government has not favored a particular identity. It's enforced, and this is a heritage from the British colonial administration, it's enforced a system of 4 languages, Chinese, English, Malay, and Southern Indian dialect of Tamil. And this is something that wasn't invented by the Singapore government. It actually goes back to the British colonial policy from the 1860s and 1870s of giving ethnic groups and identities equal emphasis. So we've tried to reflect that in the museum. How do we do this? How can a museum, which is composed of galleries and cases and objects, how can it tell these kinds of stories? And these stories are very complex and sometimes contradictory. What I've noticed in recent years is, of course, that this is something that Singapore not only faces, but other nations, especially in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, are facing. And we've been particularly attentive to the new museums which are rising in the Persian Gulf, in Qatar, in the United Arab Emirates, in Abu Dhabi. They're facing similar problems of multi-identities. What are they? Do they turn to the past and look at their trading identity? Are they Arab? Are they Persian? Are they Sunni? Are they Shiite? Are they a combination of some things? And as the new economies in the Gulf increase rapidly, the immigrant cultures are also growing rapidly, and there's a realization that there needs to be an embrace of newcomers and immigrants even in the Gulf area. So, this is our challenge, and I thought I would look at what we've done at the museum in the past few years to reposition ourselves within the Singapore context, to make ourselves, in a sense, more relevant, but also more complicated. So we've taken a step to try and problematize, to try and ask more questions rather than to provide answers about these issues of art and identity. Whether we're successful or not, we don't really know yet, but we're in a stage of unveiling some new displays and experimenting in some new ways about what our collection and what our museum would be about. The basic key to what we've done is to discard the idea that there is a single identity to Singapore. And if there is one, it is an identity of multiplicity. And what we've done is actually look at the heritage of a port city. What is a port city? Singapore has its foundations, as you probably know, most recently by the British settlement here in 1819. But that was already based on what was happening in Jakarta. We have to remember that Stamford Raffles took over during the Napoleonic Wars, took over governorship of Java, and actually lived in Jakarta for 5 years. And Jakarta was another port city set up by the Dutch that instantly brought immigrants from India, from all over Southeast Asia, and especially from China, to live and work and create a dynamic economic community. And Raffles wanted to duplicate Jakarta, then called Batavia, in Singapore. So he created a free port. He made sure that there were people were welcome and were brought not only as indentured labor, unfortunately, but also free immigration, especially from China, to live and work in the city that is Singapore. And this is part of the important heritage. I should say immediately that we now know that Singapore's history actually as a port city goes much further back, that the Indonesian kingdoms and the Thai kingdoms had set up port cities in Singapore, or what it was now Singapore, much earlier, and that its history actually stretches back to the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, and there's archaeological evidence for this. So the British did not invent Singapore, it merely resettled Singapore, and I think that's important to know. Early Portuguese maps from the 16th century already show the word Singapore on the position of Singapore, even though there were probably no more than a few hundred people living on the spot. So this is a view of Singapore as a port city. It is a recent acquisition to the collection. What we've tried to do is add things to the collection which tell this earlier history of Singapore and its region. And it's an important cross-cultural example. We are interested in having objects tell multiple stories. So a painting like this is not only a representation of Singapore in the 1850s, it is also in itself a mixture of cultures. It's by a Chinese artist that's probably trained in Canton in a westernized technique. It's not a fully Western oil technique. It is something that's influenced by the painters, the Portuguese and British painters that were active in Canton and Macau. And it's a delightful view. You've got Western sailing ships in the front, but also Chinese junks in the back. You've got the Anglican Cathedral, St. Andrews, looking more or less like it does today. That's here. Fort Canning, still up there, probably with a television tower rather than a lighthouse there. But this is a nice view of Singapore a few decades after its founding. And this is something that is an important reminder to us of the multiple communities that formed Singapore. And here again, our position on the waterfront, what we've recently done in the new wing is actually constructed this building that looks onto the river. So we've turned the museum ever so slightly from its traditional alignment towards the city back towards the river. I mean, it's often very too hot during the day to sit along the river, but in the evenings at night, this becomes a lively area where people can re-engage with the river. We have a bar and cafe that serves coffee and drinks, and it's a reminder that this particular part of the Singapore River was where the commerce happened. This is where the money was made in the 19th and early 20th century. And as recently as the 1960s, photographs show literally thousands of boats that would transport the cargo from the large ocean-going vessels in the harbor to this particular port where they were bought and sold and traded. And this is where Indians exchanged money, and Chinese communities bought and sold goods. So, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do at the museum is use Singapore's port city, the multi-ethnic, lively, commerce-based community, as a way of looking at Asia. Rather than having Asia look at Singapore, we're trying to use the multiple city, the multiple identity of Singaporeans and of the port city as a way towards the past. Now, the original organization of the museum, as I show you here on the number 1, was based on where Singaporeans came from originally. They came from southern China, they came from India, mainly southern India, they came from Southeast Asia, mainly Indonesia and Malaysia, and they came from the Arab world. There was an early tradition of Arab traders and Armenian Christians who came from the area around the Gulf and Iran. So these were the 4 supposed original communities of Singapore. Again, it's leaving out Europe, it's leaving out the white world, the West, which is, for us, unfortunate. So in our new organization, we've decided to abandon these cultures, which is the way most museums are formed. If you go to the Louvre, there's an Islamic art museum, there's a German painting wing, a Dutch painting wing. If you go to the Metropolitan, there's an Indian gallery, a Chinese gallery. Our museum is not strong enough in those areas to really reflect that, so we've decided to organize it in a completely different way around the issues of trade and religion. So those are the 2 big thrusts that we have in the museum. 1 floor devoted to each. Trade at the bottom because, of course, it's more basic, and then religion at the top because it's closer to God. But this is the basic idea. Is that trade not only brought people and made money, it also brought people in contact with each other, and it led to the exchange of ideas. And in many important ways, it led to the creation of new forms of creativity, new kinds of art, new kinds of porcelain, silver that blended different cultures. It led to people converting from one religion to another. And most importantly, perhaps in our area, it led to intermarriage. So Chinese began to intermarry with Malays. Westerners began to marry Asians, and there was a creation of a hybrid community of Eurasians, of Peranicans, of mixed people that still play an important role in many parts of Southeast Asia, although a historian may argue that many people try to deny this kind of multi-ethnic heritage. So specifically, these are some of the issues. I'm not going to go into it all, but the second major thrust is religion. And religion moves very quickly through Asia. Buddhism, of course, most famously spreads from India, not just into China and Japan, but also through Southeast Asia, south to Sri Lanka, and west into what is now Pakistan. Buddhism, of course, moves forward and also contracts. It's replaced in India by Hinduism. It's replaced in Pakistan by Islam. And of course, it migrates into the Himalayas, into Tibet, and then later into China. Hinduism also spreads, and I think we often forget that the history of Southeast Asia, the history of Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia is also a very strongly Hindu history, that Buddhism brought along with it Hinduism, that important temples were created very early on throughout Southeast Asia. And of course, Bali to this day remains a Hindu community. And then in the 19th century, immigration re-energizes Hinduism throughout the region. We will also talk about Confucianism, Taoism, and the spread of Christianity and Islam. We're trying to re-embrace important factors. Christianity, we often forget, plays a major role in Asia, not only in Manila and Korea, but also in Singapore, where Christian education since the 19th century and the rise of evangelicalism more recently has really transformed society here. And so we've tried to look at this kind of multi-religious background to the region as well. Interestingly, I just make one quick point, is that at one point it was thought that the Asian Civilization Museum should be a museum of Confucian values. And this was a very interesting aspect that was popular in the 60s and 70s in Singapore and other nations. This idea that Confucianism, respect for authority, respect for ancestors, of a regulated legal system, was important to explain the economic success of Singapore as well as Korea, Taiwan, and to a certain extent other societies like Vietnam, and then more recently in China. This was a very controversial idea. It was heavily debated among academics and in the museum world in Singapore, and it was eventually discarded as being too narrowly focused and actually probably a little bit too deterministic. But it is an idea that continues to float around certain academic and cultural circles here, that Confucianism somehow explains Asian values, especially in terms of economic success. I'm not going to go into it. I'll probably be fired. Anyway, the other thing we've done besides reorient the museum, and this is the most important and most difficult thing we did at the museum, was to institute free Wi-Fi. To go through government channels and to get government approvals to have free Wi-Fi at the museum took us 2.5 years. We also have a new app that was somewhat easier to do. It's a very nice, robust app that is highly interactive and takes you through the museum if you want to use the app. Okay, so the first gallery that we've done is about a shipwreck. And about a year ago, we took over a very important shipwreck that was discovered in Indonesia. It dates from the 9th century. It's from the Tang dynasty. It's the earliest major shipwreck ever found in Asia. It contains a gigantic cargo of nearly 70,000 Chinese objects that were bound for Southeast Asia and for the Persian Gulf. And it was discovered not far from Singapore in the waters of Indonesia, here. And it was bought by the Singapore government 10 years ago, and we took it over at the museum, and we are now displaying it in a new gallery for the first time. And we thought that this was an important starting point for the history of trade, because already in the 9th century, thousands upon thousands of objects were being mass-produced in China and shipped to the Near East and to Southeast Asia. And when one thinks of a small Arab ship, about 16 meters in length, packed to the gills with materials that sailed actually from the Near East to China, delivering some unknown cargo, and was packed up with Chinese objects before it sank on its way back, then already 1,000 years ago, trade, mass production, a currency of exchange, were already an issue. And one marvels at the fact that the objects on the boat were brought from all over China, hundreds if not thousands of miles to China, to the ports of China, and then shipped overseas. And we've established a new gallery, as well as an interactive app where you can look at the wreck underwater, because the wreck doesn't really survive. We've had to reconstruct it digitally. And there are 60,000 of these bowls, all mass-produced, hand-painted, each with a different distinctive design, but all identical in shape and quality. China produced high-quality ceramics and porcelain for the world. It had access to technology and to clay that could not be equaled anywhere in the world, and so it produced objects for the Near East and Southeast Asia, and then later for Europe and the Americas. Along with this bulk cargo, it also contained a few high-quality objects, gold and silver and high-quality porcelain of a different type. One-off, highly expensive objects made in very delightful ways with green splashes, with this tiger looking over into the mouth of a jug which forms the handle of this vessel. It's a rather extraordinary cargo. It also contains some of the earliest blue and white porcelain ever made. The two slides at the top and the right are blue and white dishes created in China, again in the 830s. And they're based actually on Iranian examples. And on the left is another object from our collection, which was made in Iran around the same time. And you can see that not only is the glaze blue, it's almost the same shade of blue, but the design of a lozenge with flowers at the end is a typical Iranian design. It's not a Chinese design that was copied in China to be sent back to Iran. So we have a very interesting and early example of the adaptation of a design by one culture for another, the making of a product based on the specific artistic needs of another culture in response to this demand. These are unique dishes. They don't exist elsewhere in China and in any other rec. And so it's a very important early example of the trade between the Near East and China. One of the things we're trying to do with this particular exhibition is to emphasize how art informs commerce. That in order to produce a product, you need creativity and you need to be responsive to the creative needs of another culture, of your consumer. The other thing we're really trying to emphasize, and we're trying to do this delicately, is that China has depended on the Islamic world for more than 1,000 years for its prosperity and its well-being. That the idea that civilizations are opposed to each other because of religion or because of ethnic tensions is completely false, because much of the wealth of early China, from the 9th to the Yuan dynasty, really depends upon this kind of trade with the Near East. And it gets even greater centuries later, where the Yuan dynasty is actually, although Buddhist, a Mongol dynasty which is related through second cousins through the leaders of Iran and Central Asia. So you have a multi-religious dynasty that also furthers trade. And this is, I think, one of the important messages we need to deliver, especially in this particular moment in history. So trade is not only about money, it's also about art, it's about ideas, and it's about cultural contact. Now, a few other examples of this. In fact, our galleries are now set up basically along this theme of identifying cultural contacts. And luckily, the government has given us the ability to build a new collection. So we've been able to enter the art market and actually acquire through gift, donation, or through purchase important objects that talk about this. And I'll just show you a few examples of this. One of the other things we need to remind our visitors is that Buddhism has its roots not only in India, but also in the Near East. And the idea of representing the Buddha or the Bodhisattvas, the enlightened individuals, actually comes not from Asia, but actually comes from the Near East. It comes from Gandhara, which is located in Pakistan and present-day Afghanistan. In fact, the representations of the Buddha arise almost simultaneously in the Kushan Empire, which ruled central India and Pakistan in the first and second centuries. And one example that I'm showing you here is this very large head of a bodhisattva that shows not only the subject matter of being a Buddhist deity, but it is heavily influenced by the classical world in the Mediterranean. Hellenism and Greco-Roman art played a very large role in the Near East. Roman Empire and the Hellenistic Empire made its way towards the Indian borders in this time, and classical art played a very, very important role in Gandhara, which is a major civilization from the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, and this is a prime example. He continues to wear Indian jewelry, of course. This is typical Indian roundels here. And he's got, a lot of hair and big earrings. But the idea of a naturalistic sculpted face done in 3 dimensions, done in a highly realistic manner, is something that's very much influenced by the classical world, by Greece and Rome. More literally, Roman is this particular gold silver cup, which was probably made in the area around Jerusalem in the first few decades of the Common Era. It shows a classical subject scene. It's a classical scene of centaurs abducting women, carrying them off on horseback. It's a typical semi-erotic subject that one might find in drinking cups. It's a cup for drinking wine. The interesting thing about this cup is that although it's made in the Eastern Mediterranean, probably around Jerusalem, is that it bears a Gandhara inscription. So it actually has an old Gandhara text saying that it was donated by an individual to a temple. And it was found in a group of objects that are associated with a Buddhist temple in what is now northern Afghanistan. So what we have is the use of a classical Roman object that made its way, not too far away from the Eastern Mediterranean to to Afghanistan and was used as a temple donation to a Buddhist institution. This object is very beautiful, but it's not unique. There are other examples of Roman objects being discovered in Buddhist temples, not only in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also in China during the Han Dynasty and in the Tang Dynasty. So the trade in materials, it's not a very large trade, it's not a bulk trade. These are highly elite objects that are nonetheless being used to trace the relationship between cultures and religions. And we find this a fascinating story. To move forward in time, there's also a lot of backwards and forwards movement. We talked about blue and white porcelain. Here's an example of a blue and white dish made in Turkey in the 15th century, another new acquisition of the museum. The cobalt blue glaze was actually mined exclusively in Iran. So the glaze had to be, it's actually a kind of cobalt mineral. It was mined and refined in Iran, and then it was shipped to China and to Turkey to produce these very beautiful ceramics. And it's not until the 17th century that native Chinese cobalt glaze is actually mined in that region. And so this is a very important thing. But even as the basic patterns move and the basic design moves, each individual culture adds new elements. The Turkish potter here on the left adds cypress trees, adds different kinds of flowers such as carnations and roses, which would not have been found in other cultures, would not have been found in China or in Persia. On the right screen is a dancing woman. This is actually a pitcher. Her arm is a holder of a pitcher, and the spout of her other arm, it actually has a hole in it, and water would pour out. And her hair is actually wooden. It comes off, and you could fill her up with wine or tea, probably, but most certainly wine. And this is a beautiful object that has a delicate red glaze, very naturally depicted, except for the blue hair, which is kind of weird. It has its own stand. It has a beautiful red and green stand, which is very important. And for decades, this kind of object was associated with Japan. And there are many old Japanese collections, for example, in Nara and Kyoto, which have similar examples of these kinds of ewers done in red. And this red glaze was very popular in Japan. Now, very recently, one of our researchers discovered that the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who ruled around the year 1600 and ruled northern India and Pakistan, had an almost identical object such as this. It's actually recorded in one of his manuscripts. It's actually drawn in one of the pages next to a passage from the Quran. The album is in Iran, in Tehran. I don't have a reproduction of it because the reproductions are not allowed. But it's very important that something that was always assumed to be native Asian, that was either something made for China or made for Japan, was actually being collected by the Islamic ruler of India around 1600. And this shows you that not only is there a kind of universality of demand, but people were interested in other cultures. They didn't need to have things specially made for them. Sometimes they were delighted by an unusual form or unusual pattern. And we see this over and over again. It's an interest, of course, in exoticism that we're familiar with. But even other cultures in Southeast Asia, in India and the Near East, were also interested in the exotic. The other example I can show you, which is not in our collection, but actually in the Aga Khan collection in Toronto, Canada, is this beautiful jug. It's a jug that's often called a monk's ewer or monk's cap jug because it imitates a Buddhist monk's headdress, and it's associated with the imperial court in China. And the known examples that we have are actually signed with imperial marks at the bottom. Very recently, however, this one has appeared and was acquired by the Aga Khan Museum, and it has, you see on the right, an inscription in Arabic. And it says that the object was again owned by a Mughal emperor, this time Shah Jahan, the son of Jahangir, the builder of the Taj Mahal, and it's dated 1643 to 44. So here again, something that we've always assumed was real Chinese, was pure Chinese, something made for the court, actually had a Buddhist reference in its very, very form, its pure white shape, was something that was interesting enough, exotic enough to be collected by an Indian ruler. More familiar is the fact that certain Chinese courts and certain reigns were particularly open to outside influence. And this is particularly true in the Ming Dynasty with the Zhengde emperor, who was very interested in Arabic and in Muslim culture and in Islam generally. One of the great explorers of the Ming Dynasty, Qing Ho, Zheng He, was in fact Muslim himself. And this is a beautiful example of a blue and white porcelain shaped as a mountain. It's a typical Chinese form of a five-mountain shape being used to rest wet brushes on. But here it's inscribed again in Arabic. It's one of about 20 objects known that have Arabic inscriptions of this type. But it too bears an imperial mark. And so either the emperor was very interested in learning Arabic, this is one of the stories that's heard, and that he owned a brush rest like this, or his courtiers, which were known to be Muslim, owned an object such as this. This trend goes really throughout many forms of Chinese culture, this integration of Islamic forms, of Arabic inscriptions. It's found especially in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, the great sultanates were, of course, Islamicized since the 14th century, if not even earlier. One of the most famous or most notable commissions is actually from Aceh on the western end of Sumatra, an important kingdom that commissioned from porcelain kilns in southern China a whole series of beautiful vessels which emulate the form and shape of the royal inscription, the 9-part seal, done in exactly this shape, and as you can see very clearly here, with extremely prolific and elaborate Arabic inscriptions, done in blue and red. This is an example that, again, in our collection, and dates from the late 16th century. And there's a very active trade between Malaysia, present-day Malaysia and Indonesia, and southern China. This is the great shipping, the great porcelain production, later also of silver, and all of the immigration, or at least the major part of the immigration from China to Southeast Asia, comes from this area, what is now Fujian province, the ports of Amoy, Xiamen, and Quanzhou, to the Philippines, to Indonesia, to Malaysia, and of course also to Singapore. On the right screen is a very beautiful kind of overall blue dish with these flowers which look like sunflowers. Morning glories is what they look like. Very, very beautiful sort of ethereal pattern. It's a very unusual dish because it's really found all over the world. It's found in Southeast Asia, but it's also been excavated in Japan from 16th century sites. And most recently, it's also been found in the United States in Virginia, in a site that actually dates from the late 17th century. So you have Ming, early Qing porcelain done in identical shapes and patterns being instantly exported around the world at this period. And this too is, I think, a very important story to tell about Chinese commerce and its international effects. One of the sections that we'll be unveiling in March is to show that China also had competition from other parts of the world, not only India but also Vietnam. And during the early Ming Dynasty, when Chinese porcelain is not exported because of political crisis, the kilns in Vietnam begin to produce high-quality stoneware. It's not true porcelain, but it's a very high quality for export around the world. And we find shipwrecks and excavation sites in the Philippines, in in Borneo, in Java, that show very high quality Vietnamese porcelain that looks a little bit Chinese, but it also has a very distinctive and very unusual flavor. The very large dish on the left, for example, has these very large fish, some of them eating other fish. They almost are cartoon-like in their characterizations, but also very, very beautifully done. So the ups and downs of trade are also immediately traceable as one producing nation declines, either by pricing itself out of the market or through political crisis, not being able to produce objects. The market picks up in other areas. At the end of the Ming Dynasty, with the collapse of Chinese trade, the destruction of the kilns, the areas of Japan instantly begin to produce porcelain to respond to the European market. So this kind of trade, innovation, and competition is not something new. These global forces are by no means unique to our age. It's something that was already happening, 1,000 to 500 years ago. So we're trying to hint at that in our galleries as well. A very unusual object is this silver vessel. It's actually a form that's called a kendi. It's a vessel that doesn't have a handle. It has a pouring spout that's attached. It's a typical Southeast Asian form. It's produced in many materials throughout Southeast Asia. And this is the earliest known form produced in Chinese silver. We, again, recently acquired it. It's something made in the 1680s. This can be conclusively dated. And it's actually produced at a time where American silver, where the silver that's mined in Mexico and in South America, had not yet made its way to China. And yet this very exquisite vessel was produced probably for an aristocratic patron in, we're guessing, in Java. But again, with very beautiful Chinese designs with mountains and temples and pagodas. Here's a beautiful example of how it's been cast in the form and then chased and punched to create this very rich design, and then gold added to the surrounding areas in gold leaf that's been fired to create this sort of gold frame around the pattern. At the same time, tobacco boxes were being made for Europeans. So you have very similar kinds of decoration. Again, a cast form with pagodas and very similar types of trees being produced for Europe, for snuff and tobacco, being produced for native Southeast Asians, for a traditional pouring vessel. And then here are other examples of kendis being made in a less exalted ware, again for Southeast Asia. The one on the right is very interesting because it's actually found near Singapore. We don't have too much archaeology in Singapore. The digs have been sporadic. Again, the need for economic development has not permitted archaeology to halt construction or highway construction so that proper excavations can take place. It's most likely to happen in islands nearby, but the shipping lanes can't be closed. These are the problems that face archaeological investigations in Singapore particularly, something that's not faced in other countries where archaeology is permitted and indeed encouraged by the national governments. But this kendi on the right is a Chinese object found in a wreck that was sailing from China to somewhere in Southeast Asia, probably Java or Sumatra in the 17th century. Europe wants Chinese objects as well, beginning in the 17th century. And we've tried to show the range of porcelain and silver and various objects that were created for export. One of the most extravagant examples is the example on the left part of the screen, which is an incense burner. It's actually a piece of porcelain. The horse and the green grass that it sits on is a Chinese porcelain, and it's been mounted in France shortly after it was made in gilded bronze. And the thing that it carries on its back, the basket as it were, is actually two teacups made of Japanese lacquer that have been set rim to rim to create this kind of circular form, and then a piece of coral has been added at the top. And it's actually an incense burner. The two cups unscrew, and there's a little a little platform inside, a little shelf, metal shelf inside, where you would have put burning incense, and then the smoke would have come out of the holes that you see along the side. It's an extravagant form. It mixes many different cultures, not only China, Japan, but also 18th century France. And we have several examples of this in the collection to show, again, the passion for Asian things and how they were transformed in Europe. The story of Christianity is something that we've also focused on recently. It's something that we've begun to emphasize because there's so many great opportunities to show things that are unfamiliar to the public, of how Christian objects were created in China, in Ceylon, in India, in exquisite, very, very interesting ways. On the left is a beautiful ivory Madonna and Child standing on a crescent moon in the Immaculate Conception imagery. It's made in Sri Lanka very early in the 16th century, probably for the Portuguese market. Her robes are very, very beautifully carved. They drape in the way that a Buddhist monk's robe would be. And very interestingly, she has 3 folds on the side of her neck, which is often a Buddhist sign of holiness. And it's interesting that the carver has used certain Buddhist elements, Sri Lankan jewelry, for example, to characterize the Christian Madonna. The example on the right is also carved in ivory, carved in the Philippines in the 17th century, very likely by a Chinese a worker living in Manila. The Chinese immigration to Manila is strongly documented, and they were known for specialization in carving ivory figures. This example, as was typical of thousands of others, was actually shipped on Spanish galleons from Manila to Acapulco and then painted in Mexico. There was a huge demand for Christian objects carved in ivory, not only in Spain and Portugal and Italy, but also in Mexico and South America. And this too is a dynamic that's very important, the relationship between, the trading relationship between Asia and the Americas already in the late 17th century. Porcelain was produced for the religious orders in China. And very interestingly, on the right is a copy of an Italian painting of the Madonna and Child with St. John by an Iranian artist in the 17th century. And this is very important. It's added to a it's added to a Persian album. The album is otherwise completely based on the Quran and from Persian legends. But here you have the addition of a Christian object as well. This too is not completely unusual. The courts in Iran and the Mughal Empire were interested in other religions, in Hinduism, in Christianity, and added it to their artistic collections. One of the most extravagant and beautiful forms that we have in the museum is this shrine, and it's actually a composite of several different elements. The basic form is actually a writing desk. You see it's a desk with drawers here at the bottom, and a tabletop which folds down, and a typical writing desk. But the top of the shrine has been turned into a Christian shrine with Christ on the cross and 2 saints here, all decorated in Chinese lacquer. This is typical Chinese lacquer on a black ground with gold decoration, with mountains and clouds. And it's a wonderful mixture of cultures because the form is British. The decoration of lacquer is Chinese, almost certainly made in Macau or Canton in the 18th century. The figure of Christ is carved in ivory. It's Goa. It's from Western India. It's brought from Goa to Macau because they were both part of the Portuguese trading empire. The saints are painted wood and added later. And eventually the shrine makes its way to Portugal. So it's a wonderful combination of different elements that derive from different sources, but create, I think, an interesting and aesthetically pleasing whole. I'll have just a quick look at a few, again, of these mixtures. And very often in Asia, one has a single workshop or a single society producing materials for different cultures and different religions. And this was true particularly for Gujarat in Western India, which specialized in the making of highly refined objects of ivory, silver, mother pearl, and lacquer, forms of resin. Here's an example of a Gujarati box made in lacquer and mother pearl. What you see in white are tiny pieces of mother pearl that have been cut to reflect light in different ways to create this fantastic pattern, and of course with an abstract Islamic inscription at the top and a more clearly identifiable passage from the Quran on the side. So this is an object made for Iran or Mughal India. You have objects made in mother pearl or ivory, carved for Europe, for India, for local markets, done with different types of animals and beasts. In Sri Lanka, you have people carving, workshops carving for the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. Everyone passes through Sri Lanka in very close proximity. It remains a strongly Buddhist community with only a little bit of conversion during the Dutch period to Protestantism. And here's a beautiful box. It's actually a tobacco pipe box that was made for the Dutch. And when we say Dutch, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean Europe. Because the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British had such strong presences in Asia, when we say Dutch, it doesn't mean the Netherlands per se. It could mean Indonesia, where there was a huge and active Dutch colony until 1946. Or it could even be made for Southern Africa, for the Cape Town colony in Southern Africa, where there was again a very vibrant and mixed community at work. Cape Town, for example, not only retains its Dutch roots, but it also maintains its Malay roots. A large number of people were immigrated from Java and Sumatra to Southern Africa, and today maintain their strong Malay identity in food, and to a certain extent, even in Malay words in Afrikaans. And finally, the mixed community of Singapore and related towns like Malacca and Penang created their own forms of porcelain and decorative arts. The Peranakans generally mean a Chinese-Malay hybrid community, people who maintain connections in dress, in language, in food, in religion with both communities, even though they identified very strongly with the overseas Chinese community. And you have the emergence of unique forms of porcelain, like this pink soup tureen, the emergence of batik that was actually produced for Chinese religious practices. Again, we have fascinating examples where Indian or native Malay batik makers would be making Chinese religious objects for the local Peranakan community and their altars. And later in the 20th century, we have strongly cross-cultural individuals, which of course point the way to the modern world. And we use in the Peranakan Museum this particular individual, Wei Huilan, who actually married a famous Chinese diplomat, Wellington Koo, and who spent most of her life really swanning around the world in different centers, Paris, London, and at the end of her life in New York and Singapore. But we did an analysis of her life and the languages she spoke and the identity she had, and it's a very interesting one. She actually grew up as a mixed Malay-Chinese girl in Sumatra. She spoke Malay at home to her family. She claims to have spoken Cantonese to her Chinese servants and staff. She went to school in the Netherlands, in the Dutch Indies in Sumatra, so she learned Dutch there. That was the language of commerce and business, of course, under the Dutch. And she also learned her own native language from her father, which was Teochew. So you've got these many different identities even as a child. When she marries a Chinese diplomat, she marries Wellington Koo actually in Europe when he was positioned as ambassador to France. She did not know a word of Mandarin, something many Straits Chinese faced in embracing the modern world. So she had to learn Mandarin. And when she goes back to Beijing, she's ridiculed by local society people because she couldn't speak Chinese correctly. So she spoke French or Chinese or English to them in order to put them in their place. So you've got these many conflicting identities. The Republic of China, the nationalist China, represented already, as it falls from power, a problematic identity. She and her father eventually move back to Singapore and take up Singapore citizen again. And at the end of her life, she settles in New York and actually becomes an American citizen. So you've got, in a sense, the typical modern person that we conclude our museum with, who has so many identities and so many languages and so many roots that that identity can't really be defined in any clear or tangible way. And I think this is part of what it is to be modern, perhaps, part of what it is to be part of a port city, a community where you came into contact with nearly everyone from all over the world, and you could be influenced and pick up those kinds of various forms and features. So in the end, although we are a Singaporean museum and we try and tell the history of Asia in various ways, we're trying to say that Asia itself is unstable, that Asia exists only because of its relationship to the rest of the world, that Islam has played a role for thousands of years, not only in the identity but also in the wealth of East Asia, and continues to play an identity in the wealth of Singapore. So it's this kind of shifting patterns of religions and trade that we're trying to embrace at the new museum here, here in Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very brilliant global overview of the Asian civilization. You have plenty of questions, so please you can select the question that you want to answer.
The first question is whether art belongs to its country of origin. I think this is a very dangerous and problematic field at the moment. Some art was created to remain in its place. Some art was created to be sold. And what is art? Is art a building? Is it a fragment? Is it a portable work of art? Is it a table that you're sitting at? The idea that art has to maintain its position throughout history is, for me, an extremely flawed one. There are, of course, cases where we would like to preserve a natural site, a historic site, a temple in its original place, and protect it as best as possible. But the question is already too broadly framed because I would say the vast majority of art and objects were created to travel and to move. Even if one believes that art and objects should be preserved as far as possible in their original settings when they were made for that setting, there is also the idea of what we learn from other cultures. And a very important philosopher said that although we want to protect historical treasures, is there not a greater value for understanding other people, other religions, other cultures, other art forms that come from far away and from ideas and cultures that we may not know and we may even be antagonistic to on some level? Is there an advantage for the trade and commerce of ideas? And I suppose that's a wider question that needs to be asked. At our museum, I should interject that we're very careful about acquiring works of art to make sure that they are legally exported, legally excavated, or have long provenances that can be affirmed and traced. That's a legal answer. That's not entirely adequate. I continue to believe that stories should be told that open boundaries in these various fashions. We've now entered a period of exchange with other governments, with India and Cambodia, as well as Indonesia, for long-term exchanges of objects that will represent their cultures in our museum. India was the first wave of this. Now 15 years ago, the Archaeological Survey of India placed on loan at the Asian Civilizations Museum a group of 15 objects that had been excavated in India, but their original sites were no longer known. And they've been put in the Asian Civilizations Museum. The question raises also the other idea of whether nations own objects or not. Do they belong? Who does art belong to, I suppose, is what that question might be. A famous example is art, a very important Buddhist stupa that was excavated in Pakistan before the partition and is now kept in Calcutta, thousands of miles away. Does it belong to Calcutta, to the museum there, even though it was excavated in what is now a different country? Does it belong to India as a whole? Does it belong to world civilization as a whole? And I don't know the answer to those questions, but I believe that we should have contact with other things. There is a great advantage to have a Picasso and a Matisse in Tehran, in a museum of modern art formed by the last regime. Those contemporary Western works are now in storage, but we hope that the opening up of the Iranian government will lead to the display of Western modern art in Tehran one day, rather than to have those things be sold back to the West. They actually belong, I believe, in an Islamic culture and in a Near Eastern setting. Sorry, long answer. Do you think there is real cultural unity in Singapore? Yes, I guess there is. And it is a mixed identity. You could say that there's a linguistic jingo and certain kinds of food forms and certain kinds of more recent inventions of national pride. There are national symbols, certainly. There's a flag and songs and a National Day parade and communal television or whatever. And there's identity to the city. There's no doubt that form eventually a national identity. But more profoundly, I think there hopefully is a belief in diversity. Why do I think the Singapore government is investing massively in culture? It's actually not investing massively in culture. We have a budget cut coming for the next fiscal year. So I think there was a push of investment for SG50. Singapore recently celebrated its 50th anniversary as an independent state from 1965. So there was a push for investment on many fronts. The new national stadium was completed. By the way, sports got more money than culture, just to put things in perspective. So there's been a push for culture, but it hasn't been massive. But I think it's important, and we take what we can. I think there is a belief that, and it's maybe a minority belief or a small belief, that culture and creativity can help in science, in business, in economics, in government, and can help in other ways. I think there's an openness to the idea that culture and the arts may have a trickle-down effect in other ways. But there are certain challenges. Art history, the history of art as a discipline, which is what I studied and most museum people study, is not actively taught in Singapore. You cannot do a graduate degree in art history at NUS. It's taught at Yale, NUS to a certain extent. The formation of a humanities college in collaboration with Yale, I think, is another step in embracing the humanities, generally embracing literature and music as part of the overall creativity of the society. So there are important trends in this way, because I think there's a belief that it benefits society as a whole. How is ACM financed? We are 80% government financed. We're really a socialist European model of a museum. We generate some admission fees and some rentals from shops and the restaurant. We've recently become free for Singaporeans, so our admission revenue is really just a small amount from tourists. We raise a lot of money through philanthropy. Here again, we're under the American model. We've been successful in the past few years of raising money for acquisitions. So we raise money for art purchases and for special exhibitions. And there's been a certain amount of success for these aspects. But 80% of our budget is is really from the government. And there's no sign of pressure yet. I believe we should be moving towards a more privately financed system, but there's no real move to a different system, no real pressure from the government so far. One of the challenges is that unlike most European and American museums, we cannot actually hold investments, so we cannot have an endowment unless we were to set up a completely private organization. So we cannot put $100 million in the bank and then draw the interest down to finance our programs. And until we move to that financial model, we really cannot move out of the government system, as it were. The Louvre, for example, used to get 80% of its money from the government. Now it gets 40% through endowment and through private contributions and revenue. Current art production. Is there Singapore's signature, new generation of Singapore artists? I'm not really fully qualified to comment on that. I'm not a contemporary art expert. My feeling is that the Singapore art scene has not created an identity yet. And this is partly to do with Singapore being, as I said, so multiple. So many artists here study abroad or work abroad. They either work in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand for inspiration, or they go to Europe, the US, and Japan. So like many artistic scenes, much of it is international. If I could divide the Singapore art scene, I would almost divide it between Southeast Asian influenced and Western influenced. And I find that artists tend to fall in either of those two categories. But a strong national identity is for me not really evident. I see more international and regional connections so far. And you can have a look at the contemporary art scene in the Singapore Art Museum and even in some installations here at the Asian Civilizations Museum. Why is culture so important? I don't know. I mean, culture can be so broadly defined that it encompasses everything, right? Culture can be the way you type your text messages. It can be the way you sit in class, or the way you interact, or the way you answer or ask questions. So if we mean high culture, I think the short answer is that we should be inspired by the past, and we should be inspired by creative people around us. Whether they're artists or musicians or, I don't know, street performers or graffiti artists. Well, you can't have graffiti in Singapore, but, creativity stirs new ideas. And I'm a historian. I study the past. And I'm continually learning from contemporary artists who have new ideas about how to interpret things, or who paint or draw a certain way that brings out an idea that I might recognize from the Tang dynasty or the Han dynasty. And I guess those kinds of creative processes are, to me, what's really important. Pirates. Yeah, pirates. Yeah, the Straits of Malacca were famous for piracy. And there's a lot of governments and shipping systems spend a lot of their life worrying about pirates. This is actually a very good point. One of the reasons the colonial shipping companies, the Far East, VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the British East India Company, were formed was actually to protect against pirates. Now you could say that that English shipping is actually based on pirates themselves, right? The British seize a Spanish silver fleet, the Dutch actually seize a porcelain shipment from the Portuguese. So piracy is actually embedded in shipping. Some of it is state-sponsored terrorism. Some of it is sold on the open market in rival countries, especially the tension between the Dutch and the Portuguese in the 17th century. It's often said that the Dutch discovered Chinese porcelain because of the seizure, the illegal seizure of a Portuguese ship, and the pirates had to do something with the 100,000 pieces of blue and white porcelain which are auctioned in Amsterdam in 1614. And that's how it came about. So the history of piracy is a really good idea. We didn't cover that in our galleries, but we should. We'll do a show on piracy. Thank you. It's a really great idea. Singapore versus Boston. Eesh. Yeah, the big difference is working for the government. I never worked, I have worked for the government before, but working for the government is very different, and it's challenging. To a large extent, the government rules, the civil service rules, the financial rules are a kind of game. And I think if you approach it as a game to be played and problems to be solved, it actually becomes kind of interesting and delightful. There is a negative side to it, and I think it's an obvious one, that there's a stifling of creativity and nimbleness. The government systems are much slower. And even though we're a government institution somewhat at arm's length from the central government, we cannot do things quickly and on the spot. Or if we want to, we have to get private funders to do it. The Singapore government is very interested in control and censorship. There are things that we cannot do. At my museum, we're isolated from this because we're a historic museum, so there's less of an interest in the past than there is in the present. But all systems have strict controls. I worked at a small private museum in Boston where we had few financial controls. We could do things very quickly. But there were always community standards that one could not offend. We had different kinds of politicians. We had different systems. We still had a board of trustees and a board of advisors who would become very upset if we ventured too far into race connections, into economic issues, if we were to become too controversial. Every society has its line, right? I think you all know that from your own society. There are things you cannot do or say. And it's really a matter of learning what those social standards are and finding a way of problematizing and addressing controversy without giving offense. I just give you an example of Boston. In Boston, there were things we couldn't say about Catholicism. Even things that, a clergyman, a Catholic clergyman would say, but if we said it in a museum, we would get in trouble and we would get letters in. We had to be very careful about describing the Immaculate Conception because there are people who believe in the non-canonical view of the Immaculate Conception. Boston is a kind of old-fashioned Catholicism, and people are really very strict about this. And one had to be very careful around certain kinds of issues, around religion and culture. And I think that's true of every society. You have to be. It's not our job to offend, even as we're being honest historically. Could street art become a career bit? Yeah, I alluded to this. No, I don't think it can. There are graffiti artists in Singapore who are actually really, really, really good, but they must do their work in highly restrictive and isolated venues, like in gallery settings, which frankly is not that different from a lot of graffiti artists in the West, which is kind of purified and isolated. But if you believe that graffiti and street art must be radical and counterculture, then there is a line that cannot be crossed in most societies, right? It depends on what you mean by street art, graffiti art, right? Right now, officially, it cannot exist in Singapore because its edge, its antagonism is already taken out. But they're good practitioners, visual practitioners. The expansion of the art business in Asia. Yeah. This is a very big topic, and it's a very difficult one. The rise of collecting in commercial galleries is phenomenal, and it's been spurred here in Singapore by government initiatives. There's something called Gilman Barracks, which is a state-sponsored venue for galleries and public spaces, which is absolutely wonderful. It's fantastic. There are old buildings from the 20s and 30s which look really wonderful. In 2 weeks, there's something called Art Stage, and you should all get tickets and go. It's at Marina Bay Sands Convention Center. Galleries from all over the world come and display their wares and their stuff, and it's very, very interesting. You see what's happening, and there are a couple of public venues. The art scene in Asia is very, very, very commercial for the most part. And what you see in museums and convention centers and galleries is pretty commercial. And I think this is a problem. There's too much money flowing around certain things. There's a big divide between Western collectors of Asian art and Asian collectors of their own art. This is true in many places, but it's even worse in Asia than it is in the US or Europe. And this gap is difficult because there's a huge difference in taste between, for example, the Western collectors who have set up their private galleries in Shanghai or Beijing and the Eastern collectors who are living there. And I don't know how to resolve this problem, and I don't have a way around it. But it's a little bit disappointing, and I think the whole art market has to go through a shakedown of several years before we have more resolution. You know, Ai Weiwei, just to give you one prominent example, he's a cult figure in the West, but you know, conceptual art is not that interesting in Hong Kong or Taiwan, let alone China. They're not that interested in it, except for a few very progressive museums. You know. And I must say, I come at it from a Western perspective, so I'm very interested in conceptual art, in sound pieces. Singapore is more receptive to it because we've got, you know, a very strong Westernized culture. But, you know, there's a kind of gap. There's still people who want to collect ink painting and, you know, more traditional realistic images. What is your background? What did you do? You know, I'm from Hawaii, and so I have no background in the arts. My father is an engineer. I mean, you know, I was encouraged to study hard subjects like science and engineering, and if not that, law. So I come from a more or less traditional family that didn't understand what art history was, and so that was a big risk that I needed to take. My family believed in education. It's kind of an Asian thing, I guess, and they supported me even though they didn't understand my choices. So this is a difficult thing. I come from a small town where, you know, no one went to the museum, and the museum was very poor, so there was a good reason not to go. Many cultures, you know, do not privilege high culture, high art, or museums, and so this is a continual challenge. How to get more people who don't think about going to the museums to consider it. You know, getting the first step into the door is very difficult. And this is a problem actually all over the world, you know, outside the big urban centers, how to get people interested in museums and concerts and that sort of thing. We're always looking at other nations and other cities about how they, you know, use festivals and how they use education in schools to get people more involved in the museum sector. I think that's, you know, that's a real challenge. So that's been my background. I have a very different background. The last one, which is that, how do you think art can open the dialogue? Wow, yeah, this is the big question, and that's, you know, that's really what I've devoted my life to doing, and I think many of your questions seem to indicate that as well. You know, coming to contact with something new is a first step. There should be a sense of surprise. Oh, what's that? You know, why does it look the way it does? You know, and it can be as specific as, why do I see something that I partly recognize, but in a different context? And this sense of surprise and encounter, I think, is essential to what a museum does and what art can do. It should open you to a new way of thinking, you know, not just in terms of, you know, making contact with another person or another civilization, but just getting you to think in a new way. And a good art exhibition, whether it's on modern painting or historical cultures or, you know, terracotta warriors from China, should surprise you. You should find something there, and it's our job as museum professionals to surprise the audience somehow, to open their eyes to something new and not just give them happy things that they want to see. And I think that's what we can do. Sometimes we expect too much of museums to become vehicles of tolerance and national identity, or to build bridges between cultures. I mean, that's nice. It's not always possible. I think the steps happen in little ways. If you remember something that that surprises and delights you, I think you've gotten something out of a museum, and that's what we're meant to do, I think, in the museum world. Yeah. Oh, you've got a phone call. Thank you. Thank you.